welcome to the Southern Plains Climate Science webinar series. This is a platform that the South Central Climate Adaptation Science Center, also known as the South Central CASC, uses to highlight projects that has been funded through our center. The South Central CASC is one of 9 regional CASCs that provide cultural and resource managers with science, tools, and information that they need to address the impacts of climate variability and change on their areas of responsibility. And we do this through partnerships and collaboration. I am your host, Cody Wen, and monitoring the chats and dropping helpful links in there as well is our science translator and communication specialist, Jennifer Hensley-Pack. Today, I am excited to highlight the South Central CASC-funded project, Time to Restore, Connecting People, Plants, and Pollinators. This project considered both Indigenous and Western science approaches to pollinator restoration management. The team has worked with the pollinator restoration community to identify and collect data on priority nectar species that are lacking flowering and seed timing information. And to present this work and their perspectives, we have the honor of hosting Jane Breckinridge, who is the director of the Tribal Alliance for Pollinators, as well as Erin Posthumus, who is the outreach coordinator for the USA National Phenology Network, as well as the principal investigator of this work. Welcome, Jane and Erin.
Thank you so much for having us. We really appreciate this opportunity to share about the project. So I'm going to go ahead and share my slides to kick us off. All right, so our Time to Restore project is really only possible because we have a wonderful team of collaborators that are all involved in this effort. So you see there's a lot of names on the screen here. We have state coordinators for the project in each of 3 states. In New Mexico, we have Kim Eichhorst, who's with the Bosque Ecosystem Monitoring Program, as well as the University of New Mexico. We have Jane Breckinridge with the Tribal Alliance for Pollinators, and you'll hear more from her in a moment. And in Louisiana, we have Gina Lloyd, who is a National Park Service contractor, who's been the Louisiana contractor for the past year, as well as Gail Bishop, who's also on the call today, who is the coordinator of our Gulf Coast Phenology Trail, which actually extends from Louisiana to Alabama. I'm Erin Posthumus. I'm the outreach coordinator with the USA National Phenology Network at the University of Arizona. And we are, I myself, along with Alyssa Rose Martin, who's also with the NPN, are kind of the coordinators for this project and managing especially the data infrastructure side of things. We also have April Taylor with the South Central CASC, who's on our team, Robert Krall, who's with the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission up in Wisconsin. He's been a great consultant on our team. He has a lot of experience with including information about plant and animal cycles into vulnerability assessments, as well as data sovereignty issues. Sue Wilder has also been a collaborator on our project. She's also with the Gulf Coast Phenology Trail. And we are fortunate to have a number of students as well. So I wanted to mention, Travis Matlock with the USA NPN, a great student who's been working on our data analysis this summer. And I also wanted to call out a couple of our past members, Cynthia Naha, who is a New Mexico coordinator with us early on in the project, as well as a student, Haley Limes, who did a lot of really great work early on in helping us to wrangle some of the data when we first kicked things off. So I'm going to pass it over to Jane to kind of introduce kind of the reason why we're doing this project. So Jane, I'll pass it to you.
Okay, thank you. So I'm the director of the Tribal Alliance for Pollinators, and we're based in Oklahoma at the Yuchi Butterfly Farm. It's our job to help tribes restore their land through native plant restoration, whether that is to support pollinators, as evident in the name, or just for if they want to support monarchs. We have a lot of people, or they also have a strong interest in trying to preserve the cultural plants that are so necessary for indigenous life as well, and those are disappearing. So Oklahoma is, we have a lot of challenges in our job. We love this job. We actually are the largest indigenous-led nonprofit working on grassland restoration in the country. but we have a lot of challenges. So we work with tribes all over the country. I think we've worked with 67 different tribes so far to date. But most of our boots in the ground work is in Oklahoma and then some up in Minnesota as well. In Oklahoma, there are just so many challenges to doing this work. And one of the top ones that drives kind of everything else is just the scale of the work that needs to be done here. We have really badly degraded habitat, pollinator habitat, monarch habitat across much of Oklahoma. After the big dust bowl in the 30s, there was a lot of grassland conversion. The native plants were not, they were taken out on purpose, and the non-native grasses were put in. We also have a lot of lands that have been overgrazed, too much herbicide, too much pesticide. We have very few of our native forbs and native prairies left. So as we try and address that, one of the, we've got several challenges, more than several, but we have a lack of locally sourced native seed resources, which is something we've focused a lot of our efforts on. At this point, we do have a fairly good sized native plant seed bank. It's the largest one in Oklahoma. It's got 226 species, but we need more. And trying to really protect biodiversity. We've got challenges with not enough individuals that have experience in doing this kind of work and training, and so we provide a lot of training about how to do this. We're kind of running uphill because tribes historically were excluded from many conservation efforts, mainstream conservation efforts, both by federal agencies and by the NGOs and the conservation movement. So tribes were not included as partners, so we're trying to mediate that. And then maybe the biggest challenge of all is just that climate change is changing these ecosystems so quickly. And we do need more guidance on which native plants are going to have better resilience, better adaptability with bloom time. Because we're out there on the farm, our home base is a 68 acre campus on original native allotment land, with 14 acres of prairie and then another 20 acres of restored prairie, and all sorts of things in between. But what we're seeing, because we're out there every, 7 days a week, 52 weeks a year, is that these bloom times are being massively shifted. Things are not blooming when they're supposed to. It's very alarming. We're seeing freezes earlier and later. So what we need really to help us to do this work, if we're going to do it properly and not just restore for now, but to restore to make sure that these are viable ecosystems in the future, is needing more aggregated data from the region and to understand which bloom times are going to be more synchronous, and also just models of what to expect in the future, because we're spending a lot of time and effort. We're guiding a lot of tribal people doing this. We want to make sure that we're doing the right things so that the work we do will still be relevant and useful, 10, 20, 50 years from now. So that's why it's been such an amazing thing for us to be able to be a part of this project, because that's picking up that missing piece that we needed so badly. So we were so grateful to be invited to be a part of it. So thank you, Erin.
Thanks, Jane, for sharing that. It's really great to have that background and kind of understanding from someone who's working with people on the ground, why we're doing this effort. So just to kind of state again, the overall goal for this effort is really to try to give those like Jane who are working on pollinator restoration more detailed and also locally relevant information on both flowering and seed timing for nectar plants. And then also, as Jane mentioned, what does this look like in the future? How can we kind of try to predict what's going to happen under future climate conditions with these plants? So one of the main ways we're trying to do this project is with lots of input from people who we hope will use the data. So we don't want to just be, making models, making products, calendars, things like that, without having that crucial input. So this kind of lays out our general overview of the project. We started out with trying to understand the needs of those who need this information, what exactly they're looking for. Then we have a data collection component. Then we're moving on to creating the actual calendars and models that are going to be informing people doing pollinator restoration. And then also a big piece that's science translation, trying to make sure that people were giving this information to understand the information. So we have kind of different methods for input from stakeholders in each of the stages of the project. So for understanding needs, a lot of what we did was through stakeholder workshops, which I'll describe more in a moment. And we're really trying to get the kind of information we can use to understand, what kind of products do they need, and then what should those things look like? What is the format that these things should be in? How would they like the information delivered? In the data collection phase, we're trying to get input also through the stakeholder workshops to inform what kind of information should we be going after, and then what are the species we should be focused on. In the creation of the actual products, the calendars and the models, we're getting input through different surveys, as well as quarterly calls that we host with this community, trying to get information on, preferences, what should the calendars look like, what different components would you like, how would you like them laid out. And then the science translation piece, that's kind of like from now going forward, does this make sense to you? Can you give us more feedback so we can use that in revisions going forward? So in the stakeholder engagement workshops, we held these early on in the project in the first couple months when we started back in the fall of 2021. And we held a kind of a kickoff workshop. We had about 50 people participate, and this is the breakdown of those individuals. So we had, even though we were focused on 3 states for this initial phase of Time to Restore, just because we felt like, we wanted to try to make sure that we could do our best in 3 states rather than trying to stretch ourselves into covering Texas as well. Although, as I'll mention later on, we are going to be expanding the project to Texas going forward. But we really focused in on Louisiana, New Mexico, and Oklahoma. And we also invited people from all the states in the region to participate. So we did have a number of people, actually quite a few from Texas, that participated in the initial kickoff workshop. And these people came from a lot of federal organizations, agencies, Fish and Wildlife Service, Park Service, BLM. We also had quite a few state agencies represented. We had a lot of representation from different tribes and pueblos in the region. A lot of participation from master gardeners. These are a great audience as well. People that are concerned about pollinators, that have a lot of knowledge of plant identification. They make really good data collectors. And then a bunch of people from other organizations as well, universities, different NGOs, things like that. And then we did host, after our kickoff workshop, 3 different 1.5-day state workshops for Oklahoma, New Mexico, and Louisiana. And those were to really focus in on the needs of those people in those different states. So we did a number of kind of breakout sessions and things at the workshops, trying to get information about the needs of this community. So the first thing we asked about was, where do you get information right now on when plants are flowering, the bloom times, and then when are they going to seed? That kind of help to guide maybe what plants you're planting for a certain pollinator. So the answers range from different planting guides that are available from groups like Xerces Society and Pollinator Partnership. There are a number of plant lists and databases that people mentioned, online resources. Also just even printed guides, field guides, master naturalist guides, and then just general guidance from other organizations. And then a lot of people mentioned just local observations and knowledge that they held or their communities held. We also ask about kind of what are the factors that you think about when you're picking out plants for pollinators. A number one thing was the location or the habitat, thinking about, what am I trying to restore? Is it a small planting area that's in an urban garden, or is it a natural prairie that I'm trying to restore and put the plants back that used to be there? Also, which pollinators I want to support. Some people are interested in specialist pollinators, so they're planting for that. Some people are trying to just plant a diversity of plants to attract lots of different pollinators. Also, people considered the amount of effort, thinking about, how much effort is this going to be maybe to keep the plants alive, and also trying to think about how these plants might do from a climate perspective with warmer temperatures in the future. People also had to contend with, where can I get the plants and the materials I need, and whether they are locally adapted. A lot of people mentioned that it's hard to find local native plants that are, genetic varieties that are from their area. And then a lot of people talked about the plant characteristics themselves. So what are the water needs of the plant? What are the soil needs? Is this an aggressive spreader? Maybe they want that or they don't, depending on the size of the space, what they're aiming for. The resilience of the plant, and that came up, things like heat tolerance, drought tolerance, whether it's freeze tolerant. Also thinking about natives versus non-natives. This came up and was an interesting conversation, thinking about, I want to plant things that are native. I also recognize that, it might be, I have to go with near natives, things that are better adapted to maybe a warmer climate. And how do I contend with that if I'm trying to keep an area kind of like in the pure form of, the native plants that used to be there 100 years ago or so. And then also seed collection, is it easy for me to grow this plant? Some people thought about, what is the bloom coverage I'm hoping to provide? Am I trying to cover the entire season, or maybe it's just trying to aim for supporting monarchs in their spring or fall migration? And also plants that do double or triple duty. So thinking about not just the nectar plants, but also maybe the host plants for caterpillars, things like milkweeds, as well as other nectar plants, things like that. We also ask about the challenges that people have encountered. The number one thing was funding, of course, being able to support this work, and also just like people capacity. Also being able to think about it long term. You might get funding for maintaining or restoring an area, but not for maintaining it over the long term, over many years. Also, the public perception of weeds as kind of being messy and ugly is something that a lot of people contended with. Also just finding those native plants, dealing with invasive species that come into your restored areas. Some people mentioned allergies as an issue, just dealing with allergies as you're out trying to do the restoration work. And also just the political wins, trying to get things done when maybe funding is at a short time scale because of the change in different administrations. We also asked about sources of success. The top things were just the ability to leverage volunteers and citizen science, being able to use that people power to get work done. Partnerships was another thing. A lot of people had successes around education and engagement. Some people just talked about their own individual successes, just being able to get an area restored and have that local diverse pollinator community that they can kind of see as a big success for them. Others talked about prescribed fire as a very useful tool that's worked well. Others had success with getting local municipalities involved in their work. And then also just changing people's perception, maybe convincing someone that a bunch of weeds isn't necessarily ugly, that they, it's an area that really supports pollinators. And so that's a beautiful thing. And then we talked a lot about the resources that people need to do this work. And so the top thing, of course, was the data and information that's needed. So Jane mentioned this, we need more information about when things are blooming, when things are going to seed, information that's more localized to an area. A lot of the information that's out there, people mentioned in like those plant guides, is generally for a region at best, maybe an eco-region, but usually on the scale of a state or larger. And it's often not really taking into account future climate conditions as well. So they want to have information that's localized to their area, more specific, that shows kind of what is the natural variability I can expect as well. And then also how will climate change play a role in changing that timing going forward. So the major action we've taken with that piece of feedback is the phenology data collection that we've started for this project, and I'll talk about that more in depth. But we also got really good feedback on how people really just want more information about what species to plant, not necessarily in the context of future climate conditions, but just some people didn't even have the knowledge or the access to a lot of those resources that others mentioned. So I think a great part of this project has been connecting people together, kind of sharing resources. And so as part of this project, we started a spreadsheet that is open to everyone who's been part of the workshops. And we keep track of all those resources I mentioned, like all those planting guides, the online resources, databases, things like that, to make sure that everyone knows about all these resources that already exist. And then another thing that came up was a lot of people feel like they don't have the knowledge about collecting seeds, how to process seeds. Some seeds you can't just pick them off a plant and then put them in the ground. There has to be stuff that's done to them. And Jane will talk about that a little bit later as well. But that was a big need that came out, and we were able to have Jane and others at the Tribal Alliance for Pollinators host a webinar that was really very popular and I think really helpful for people to be thinking about the methods that are out there, the resources available for doing that seed processing. And then we also talked about some special considerations for the data. So we have a lot of participation from tribes and pueblos, and we wanted to recognize that, if we're doing data collection as part of this project, we're not going to try to fit everyone into one method for data collection. So we kept it open to how people want to collect information. We're not requiring people put it all in a public database. It's kind of up to each individual tribe and pueblo what they'd like to do with their data. But we also recognize that there's a good opportunity here because this is a regional effort for these members of tribes and pueblos to leverage the information that's being collected, and they can look at the data. Even if they're not putting the data into the databases, they can see the other data that have been put in there by people near them and kind of leverage that information, as well as collect their own data for their own purposes. And we also wanted to understand about how the information we're going to be generating about the nectar plants, how that fits in with the pollinators as well. And we aren't collecting data on pollinators as part of this project, but there are a lot of other great organizations out there. So we're thinking about how we can, maybe give our information to these other organizations like SC Society, Pollinator Partnership, so they can kind of integrate everything too, and we can have both that the plant information as well as the pollinator information. So then we ask a number of questions to kind of get at things that will inform the data collection. So we wanted to know what is it about flowering and seed timing that's most useful? Is it knowing about when things start flowering or going to seed, how long they're doing that, the bloom period or the length of time that ripe seeds might be on a plant? Is it the peak in when things are happening, or is it that flexibility in when things are starting? Maybe there's certain plants that from year to year, they have a lot of fluctuation in the start of flowering or the peak in flowering. And really it was all those things. I think the top thing was peak across all the different state workshops, but we recognize that, okay, everyone is interested in basically all of these pieces of information. So let's keep that in mind as we create the products. We also ask about preferences on, what kind of platform would you want to use? So Nature's Notebook is the platform that we have through the USA National Phenology Network. It's a national plant and animal phenology observation program. It has an app as well as a website. It allows people to record long-term observations of plants and animals that's kind of site-based. So for a plant, you would tag a particular milkweed plant and then go back to that same plant and make repeated observations over time. This really gives us some rich information on when things start. So being able to record both the absence and when things are not happening, as well as the presence, lets us really pinpoint the start of when things happen, as well as the peak. We also record the intensity of those different life stages. So we ask about, do you see flowers or flower buds? Do you see open flowers? And then also how many flowers you see and what percent. So we really get a lot of in-depth data. It is a more rigorous program. So, it's a little bit more of a learning curve. People have to set up a site that they go back to over time. So it's really intended to be a repeated long-term observation program. We also asked about iNaturalist, which is a really popular program. It has, a huge number of users, particularly in Texas. It's very popular in Texas. And this is great for more incidental observations, and it also allows you to take photos. So this is more of an entry-level program, I would say, because it allows you to not necessarily know the species you're looking at. You can take a picture of flowers on a plant. You can leverage the researchers that are going on there to verify records. So you can get a lot of data on flowering, although it doesn't give you the absence data, and it doesn't necessarily give you the intensity data. But by using these two together, we can really get a lot of information. So we had, more people were interested in iNaturalist, but people from all 3 states were interested in Nature's Notebook. And then we had a couple people in New Mexico that were interested in just hosting the data privately. So for the collecting data component of the project, which we started at the beginning of last year, 2022, we decided that we really needed to kind of hone in on a suite of priority species. We would like to collect data on all the species that people care about, and we came up with a pretty long list of almost 100 species from the workshops that people mentioned were important to them. But we also realized that we don't have a lot of data collectors yet as part of this project. And so we didn't want to have everyone kind of spread out over many, many species. We wanted to focus efforts so we could have a deep data set on a number of kind of limited species. So we came up with this short list of 8. This was across all the 3 states. People, they voted in the different workshops on the longer list, and then we narrowed it down that way. So this has been kind of the focus of our efforts over the last 2 years. So through our data collection, we did a Train the Trainers workshop last year, which was intended to kind of, give information out to particularly the stakeholders that we have that work with groups of volunteers, people that might be able to kind of leverage efforts of people that may be visitors to a location. And we gave them lots of training materials. We also had our state coordinators, Kim, Jane, and Gail, hosted trainings in each of the 3 states. And then we also did a lot of outreach. So we had posters that we had handed out in the different states. We had postcards that were handed out at different events just to try to get the word out. And we had on both of those things participation through either Nature's Notebook or through iNaturalist as kind of 2 different options. So I'm going to turn it back over to Jane to kind of describe their efforts locally in Oklahoma.
Right. So I have to say, although we have a lot of enthusiasm for native plant restoration and helping pollinators, it's been hard to get people excited about the data collection element of this. And this has been one of our big challenges. So we've done training on this, on the data collection, and it's just been hard. People really, they've not been as enthused about using Nature's Notebook. iNaturalist seems to have a lot more support just among the people we work with. But the nice thing is that we kind of are understanding it better. It just took a while to, I think, forget people's head just wrapped around this project. So we're excited moving forward. We're going to have better data collection. Again, because of where we are based, it was very easy to have data collection training workshops. We have our own prairie, and we also have about I guess 24 seed propagation beds with native plants too, and so that's a really easy one to use as a training thing as well. The part that was a little easier, even though it's really more complex, is about seed processing, because as Erin said, that's one of the big obstacles to doing this kind of work is the lack of the available seed resources. And this is seed processing. It's kind of a lost art. I think everybody 100 years ago, probably a lot more people knew how to do that. Nowadays, they don't. So we do a lot of that hands-on at the farm and during in-person workshops about learning how, the whole step all the way through from, learning how to do the field identification of the species you want when they're blooming, then how to flag them so that you're going to be able to recognize them when they're all dried up and ready to be collected. Methods for actually collecting the seeds so that they'll be viable later, which is actually a little harder than it sounds. It's not hard, but there's just some basic tricks you got to learn. Otherwise, your effort's pretty wasted. So we train people how to collect those seeds, and then how to be able to know how to clean them properly and then store them properly. And then we also talk about how to get them to germinate as well, how to put them through cold moist stratification, and then germination and transplantation and growing out. So we do all that on site. We can have workshops. What was kind of neat is during this project is there was a lot of questions about seed processing, and we were able to do a webinar about it. And with our 2 program coordinators, sorry about that phone there, with our 2 lead program coordinators, Colin Spriggs and Brandon Gibson, and being able to walk people through this process remotely. And we're also very big on Train the Trainer and trying to build capacity for this kind of work, not just among tribes, but throughout the region, throughout the country, because it seems like a lot of people want to do this, and the knowledge is not always readily accessible out there. So that was really neat to be able to partner with Erin and her folks to be able to get that information out beyond our tribal audience that we normally work with. We also have had a kind of a real initiative about just trying to explain about phenology and why it's important. It's something that is not really, it's not a buzzword out in the general population. But once you start talking about it with people, particularly working with Indigenous people, it's something that is very much a part of the culture, about being in sync with those natural rhythms and those natural occurrences. So it's really building on those things that are so intrinsically a part of Native culture to begin with. It's just a matter of getting people to get their heads wrapped around the science and why it's so important, and why this is a great thing for our youth to be involved with as well, trying to boost those STEM skills. So that's been an important part of our efforts to do data collection, is trying to just even do outreach and explain why this is important. So and also just teaching about climate change resilience strategies, which are obviously one of the big drivers of this whole project and why we're doing that. So so again, these are things that are a part of the conversation. I think a lot of times in general population and Indigenous population, but to be able to articulate these and convert them into action is a really powerful thing to me. And so again, working with Erin and Alyssa, it's been really nice for us to be able to have a really nice framework for how we're going to advance this and move this forward and grow and build it and partner with other people to synergistically maximize resources. So I'll hand it back to you, Erin.
Thanks, Jane. All right, so the next step, after the data collection phase, which we're still doing data collection, but kind of moving on to try to synthesize some of this information to be able to present, what we found so far back to our stakeholders. We've been working on that this summer. We really started out with trying to understand, the limitations of the different data sets that we're working with. I mentioned with Nature's Notebook, it is a higher learning curve, so we don't have as much data there. We do have several sites in the region that have long-term data, which is great, but not as many as we'd like, so we're still working on that. And then with iNaturalist, understanding that that's just going to be presence information. So how do we fit that together with the long-term data from Nature's Notebook? We worked through a lot of data cleaning steps to try to make sure we're doing all those important steps as part of the processing. And then we came up with a step of, or different steps to be able to figure out the start of flowering and seed timing, the duration, and also the peak. And really the peak was the most challenging, because especially with the Nature's Notebook data, we're trying to integrate the information about the number of flowers and the percent of open flowers, and what do we determine as the peak in that. And it's really different for different species. So we spent quite a bit of time working through that, and we now have a process for that going forward, which is really helpful. And then in the last couple of months, Alyssa Rose Martin especially has been working through exploring climate drivers. So for the species that we do have enough data for, what can we try to figure out about what are the variables like temperature, precipitation that are influencing the timing of the start of flowering or the peak in flowering, and coming up with these drivers through linear models. And we also wanted to make sure we're taking into account preferences from stakeholders. So while we're doing this, the creation of the deliverables, we had a couple surveys that we sent out to our stakeholder group asking about their preferences. So this is an example of one of the questions where we ask about with a phenology calendar, would you rather have a single species calendar or one that showed multiple species? And you can see how the answers divided out there, with more people interested in that community level calendar. But we did have a number of people that still wanted the single species calendar that had that more rich information. So here's an example of one of our calendars that we've developed. This one is for common buttonbush. And what we're looking at here is basically 3 different pieces of information. So the top graph is actually data from iNaturalist from the period of 2014 to this year. This is presence records. So this is basically all the data that have been sent in that are research grade, which means someone has verified the photo, that show common buttonbush records. So you can see kind of the magnitude of when things are peaking in the number of records for that species, kind of in late May and then again in the fall, or late summer, I guess. And then we also have the bottom 2 here from Nature's Notebook. The middle one is the kind of the intensity data that I mentioned. So what is the number of open flowers? This was something that we've come up with that is a combined metric of that number of flowers and also the percentage of open flowers. So we turn that into a number of open flowers on the plant. And you can see kind of how that lines up with the iNaturalist data. We do kind of see those two areas of higher peaks in the the early part, late spring, early summer, and then kind of later summer. And then we also have the proportion of basically like how many records do we have for open flowers overall. And so the darker colors represent the more records that we have on this species. So you don't really see as much of that darkness here, a little bit, but you see it more concentrated in the fall. So by looking at kind of all of these pieces of information, it gives us a sense of when the nectar is available for common buttonbush in the region for this species. And as we add more data, we'll be able to kind of parse this out. This is a regional level calendar, but we're hoping to be able to, have more specific, even within states, site level calendars that will have this richness of information, maybe for like a part of a state. But we don't quite have enough data for that yet. So we're going to be continuing on with the data collection so we can have more localized calendars as well. This is an example of a community level calendar. This one is for Oklahoma. And so bringing in this is the common buttonbush data from Oklahoma, as well as a couple other species. So common sunflower was another one of our priority species. We didn't have enough data on any of the other priority species for the state, but silver maple was another species that was kind of lower down on that list that people voted on, but it was actually voted pretty high for the state of Oklahoma. So we brought that in to have another, because we did have quite a bit of data actually collected by a university, which is why you see there's a big gap in the middle here, is because sometimes, with the way that we have our different partners participate, a university classroom that's not there in the summer is not going to be collecting data. So it's another reason why we need to have more people recording data so we can fill in these gaps. But this will show us kind of a broader picture of different plants in the community and when they have their open flowers. And this actually also shows the ripe seed data that we have as well. So we've got each of those for each species. And again, the darker colors are the more records that we have. So common buttonbush, the flowering is concentrated again in the early summer, late summer, and then we've got ripe seeds happening kind of following those flowers here, and then the majority of those are going to be in the fall. And you can see the kind of the patterns for the other species as well. And then we also are showing here some of the climate drivers analysis that Alyssa has done. So this corresponds to each of these species. So we're trying to identify, which of these climate variables seem to have an influence on the timing. For common buttonbush, it had a relationship with spring minimum temperatures, where the onset of flowering was connected to spring minimum temperatures, where for each degree of warming that you have, onset of flowering happens 2 days earlier, and peak in flowering happens 2 days earlier. For common sunflower, it was fall minimum temperature that seemed to have an influence, where we had both flowering onset and the peak is connected. So per degree day warming, we have 7 to 8 days earlier for both of those metrics. And then for silver maple, there were a couple different variables that kind of came out as important. So for flowering onset, we had both the winter maximum temperature and the spring max temp. And then the start of peak was influenced by the spring maximum temperature. So what we're hoping to do is, as we're able to make more models for more species, we can actually use climate projection information. So if we know that a state or part of a state is going to be a certain number of degrees warmer in the future, we can bring that together with these climate drivers information to see how many days earlier these species might be in the future. So the way that we're delivering this information is through info sheets that we have for each of the 3 states. We are putting those together right now, finishing those up in the next couple weeks. We have in each of them a summary of what's been found in the phenology literature so far. So what have other researchers found about what's shifting with flowering timing and seed timing? We're also bringing in climate projection information for each state. We have both the community seed bloom calendars, as well as an example of the species calendar that has more data, those 3 different pieces. And then we're also putting together a story map that describes the project, kind of like the whole process, as I described here from the stakeholder workshops. up through the products that we've created. We also ask in our workshops, what's the most useful form of delivery for this kind of information? And we talked about climate analogs to kind of understand, future shifts in climate. Would it be more useful to see, what existing location, your future location will look like? Like say, if you're in northern New Mexico, it might look like a place that's farther south that you maybe have a sense of what that's like. Or would you rather have a plant species list or bloom calendar that has information about kind of the climate drivers information? And so more people said this one, but by far the highest vote was for both of those. So that we're keeping that in mind as we put together these products, that we're trying to be thinking in both the climate analog kind of method of delivery as well as a species calendar. Just to kind of show, I won't go through all these, but just to kind of show the kind of information we're including about the phenology research. There really haven't been many studies in the region. Most of these studies are from the Midwest, and some of them are prairie focused studies. So we're bringing those in as well. It's kind of something that's maybe not exactly the same for the area, but might have some similar species. This one from the southeastern coastal plain was, I think, the only study we found that was in the region that kind of describes things that people have found about climate drivers and how things are shifting. We are also leveraging the great tools that the South Central CASC has available on their website for climate projections. So they've actually downscaled a lot of climate projections for the region. So we're using those to put together a summary for each of the info sheets on how things are going to be changing in each state for the mid-century projection. And as far as next steps, we are finishing up what we're calling phase 1 of our project, the one that started in 2021 at the beginning of September. So we're going to have the info sheets and the story maps. We're also going to be soliciting feedback from our stakeholder group over the next couple months to get input on, how the info sheets are working for them. And really that will inform our phase 2. So we were just funded for a second phase by the South Central CASC. And what we're hoping to do with this next phase is really get more data. We really need to fill in those gaps. We have kind of sparse data for some of the species. We want to make sure that we collect more data. We're really going to ramp up on getting long-term data collection sites set up. We're also going to expand the species list so we can bring in some more of the species that different groups care about. We're adding on Texas, so we'll be doing a Texas stakeholder workshop early next year. We're also going to bring in herbarium data. We realize that by bringing in that kind of more historical data, we can add a lot to our climate models to really have that more depth of data for some species that we might only have a few years of contemporary data for. And then we're going to be updating our calendars and the info sheets, making a new story map to describe everything. We're also going to be piloting a couple cool tools. One is a seed notification service for Oklahoma, working with Jane. And that'll really enable us to kind of see how we can have a notification service where we might say, like, people are reporting ripe seeds within 50 miles of you. You might want to go out and check your plants. And then we're also going to be piloting kind of the grand vision of this project, which is a climate smart planting palette tool, which will be kind of like a calendar interface, but you'll be able to see kind of put in like a future date and be able to see what that does to the timing of the plants and have that be a more visual way to understand those climate drivers. So we also have we do quarterly calls with our stakeholder group. So if anyone would like to join us, feel free to send me an email and I can add you to that list. The next one will be at the end of this month. And I've included my email here as well as Jane's email. Again, thank you to the South Central Climate Adaptation Science Center for funding the project.